bound by a secret. Lady Marjorie of Winthorne had always known her fate to wed Lord Edmund Warwick, the man responsible for her family's ruin. But as he lifted her veil, his voice was softer than she expected. "You are my wife now," he murmured. "And I am not the monster you." Chapter 1. The unveiling of a bride. The chill of the stone chapel seeped through the thin silk of Lady Marjorie's gown, a stark contrast to the feverish heat that pulsed beneath her skin. Each echoing footstep of the approaching procession felt like a hammer blow against the fragile remnants of her composure. Winthorne, her beloved childhood home, felt a lifetime away, swallowed by the mists of memory and the bitter reality of this day. She was to be wed to Lord Edmund Warwick, the man who had orchestrated her family's downfall, the architect of their ruin. It was a marriage of duty, a sacrifice demanded to secure a fragile peace, a peace bought with her freedom. Her fingers, laced tightly together, were clammy and trembling. The scent of incense, usually a comfort, now choked her, mingling with the heavy perfume of the noble women gathered to witness her humiliation. She could feel their eyes, pitying, curious, perhaps even gloating. They saw a pawn in a political game, a prize of war. They did not see the storm raging within her, the fierce battle between the dutiful daughter and the woman yearning for something more, something she could no longer even name. The heavy oak doors of the chapel creaked open, revealing a flood of gray light from the overcast sky and the imposing figure of Lord Warwick. He was taller than she remembered from their brief, strained encounters in the past, his shoulders broad beneath the dark velvet of his surcoat. His face, etched with the harsh lines of a seasoned warrior, was framed by dark hair threaded with silver at the temples. He moved with a quiet authority, a predator's grace that sent a shiver of apprehension down her spine. This was not the boy she dismissed years ago. This was a man forged in the crucible of war and ambition. Her father, Lord Alaric, his face pale and drawn, placed her hand in Warwick's. The touch, though gloved, was surprisingly gentle. It was a stark contrast to the iron grip she had expected, the possessive claim of a conqueror. His hand was warm, calloused, and strong, a warrior's hand, yet it held hers with a restraint that bordered on reverence. The thought was absurd, a flicker of foolish hope in the desolate landscape of her heart. The bishop's voice droned on, the ancient Latin words washing over her, meaningless and hollow. She focused on the intricate carvings on the altar, tracing the patterns of intertwined leaves and mythical beasts with her eyes, seeking an anchor in the swirling chaos of her emotions. She would not weep. She would not give Warwick the satisfaction of seeing her break. She would endure, as she had endured the loss of her brothers, the dwindling fortunes of her house, the constant fear that had become her shadow. Then came the moment she had dreaded, the lifting of the veil. It was a sheer, gossamer thing, embroidered with tiny seed pearls, a fragile barrier between her and the world she was about to enter. Warwick's fingers brushed against her cheek as he lifted it, a fleeting touch that sent an unexpected jolt through her. His eyes, a deep, unsettling gray, met hers. They were not cold, as she had imagined, but held a complex mixture of emotions she couldn't decipher, a hint of weariness, perhaps a shadow of regret, and something else, something that made her breath catch in her throat. He did not smile. His expression remained solemn, almost grave. But his voice, when he spoke, was softer than she expected, a low rumble that resonated deep within her. "You are my wife now," he murmured, the words carrying a weight that went beyond the legal and political ramifications of their union. "And I am not the monster you believe me to be." The words hung in the air, a challenge, a promise, a plea. She met his gaze, searching for any hint of deception, any trace of the ruthless lord who had shattered her world. But she found only a profound weariness and a surprising vulnerability that mirrored her own. He, too, was trapped. She wanted to lash out, to scream her defiance, to accuse him of his crimes. But the words died in her throat, choked by the sudden, inexplicable tightening in her chest. She could not deny the flicker of something that had ignited within her. Not hope, not yet, but perhaps curiosity. a reluctant acknowledgement that the man before her was more than the sum of his actions, more than the enemy she had been taught to hate. The bishop pronounced them husband and wife. The cold metal of a ring, bearing the Warwick crest a snarling wolf's head slid onto her finger, a heavy weight, a symbol of her new reality. It felt like a shackle, yet, strangely, it also felt grounding. As the assembled guests surged forward, offering congratulations and veiled condolences, Marjorie felt a hand at the small of her back, guiding her gently through the throng. Warwick's hand. A possessive gesture, yes, but also protective. She glanced up at him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He was watching her, his gray eyes intense, unreadable. The chapel, the crowd, the weight of her new life, it all faded into a blurred background. Only he remained, a formidable presence, a mystery she was now bound to unravel. And in that moment, amidst the ruins of her past, a sliver of something unexpected pierced the darkness. Not love, not trust, but a fragile, nascent understanding. The journey ahead would be fraught with peril, with the ghosts of old betrayals and the ever-present threat of new ones. But for the first time in a long time, Lady Marjorie of Winthorne, now Lady Warwick, felt a flicker of determination. She would survive this. And perhaps, just perhaps, she would find something more than mere survival in the arms of her enemy. The unspoken question hung heavy and dangerous in the air. Was he the cage, or a possible key? Chapter 2. Oaths Sworn in Stone. The journey to Warwick Castle was a blur of gray skies, windswept landscapes, and the rhythmic clatter of horses' hooves. Marjorie rode beside her husband, a silent, watchful presence. He made no attempt at conversation, for which she was grateful. The silence allowed her to retreat into the fortress of her own thoughts, to grapple with the enormity of the change that had overtaken her life. The castle, when it finally loomed into view, was an imposing structure of gray stone, perched atop a craggy hill overlooking a vast, windswept moor. It was a fortress, built for defense, not for comfort. Its high walls, thick battlements, and narrow windows spoke of a history steeped in conflict, a constant readiness for battle. It was a far cry from the sun-drenched gardens and airy halls of Winthorne. As they rode through the massive gates and into the inner courtyard, Marjorie felt a wave of apprehension wash over her. This was his domain, his power base. Here, she was utterly at his mercy. The courtyard bustled with activity, squires tending to horses, men at arms polishing weapons, servants scurrying about their duties. All eyes turned to them as they dismounted, a mixture of curiosity and deference in their gazes. Warwick helped her down from her horse, his hand lingering on hers for a moment longer than necessary. Again, she felt that unexpected warmth, that subtle strength that both unnerved and intrigued her. He led her towards the great hall, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back, a gesture that was both possessive and protective. It was a constant, subtle reminder of her new status, of the bond that now tied them together. The great hall was vast and dimly lit, the high, vaulted ceiling lost in shadows. A huge fire roared in the hearth at the far end, casting flickering shadows on the stone walls, which were adorned with tapestries depicting scenes of battles and hunting. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, roasted meat, and something else, something metallic, the faint, lingering odor of steel and blood. A long table dominated the center of the hall, laden with food and drink. Several men, presumably Warwick's closest advisors and knights, rose as they entered, their faces etched with a mixture of curiosity and caution. They were a hardened lot, their bodies bearing the scars of countless battles, their eyes wary and assessing. Warwick introduced her formally, his voice devoid of any warmth, yet laced with a subtle undercurrent of pride. "My lords, may I present my wife, Lady Marjorie of Warwick." The men bowed, their expressions carefully neutral. Marjorie inclined her head in acknowledgement, her heart pounding against her ribs. She felt like a lamb brought before a pack of wolves. She could sense their scrutiny, their unspoken questions, their assessment of her worthiness to be the wife of their lord. One man, older than the rest, with a silver beard and piercing blue eyes, stepped forward. "Welcome, Lady Marjorie," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "I am Lord Alaric Lord Edric, Warwick's uncle and his most trusted advisor." He was looking at her, but the name sent a wave of ice through her. Alaric, her father's name. A coincidence, and yet Marjorie forced a polite smile. "It is an honor to meet you, Lord Edric." She hoped her voice didn't betray the tremor of fear that ran through her. The meal was a strained affair. Marjorie picked at her food, her appetite gone. She was acutely aware of Warwick's presence beside her, his every move, every glance. He ate sparingly, his attention seemingly focused on the conversation around him, yet she sensed that he was acutely aware of her discomfort, of her unspoken resistance. After the meal, Warwick led her on a tour of the castle. He showed her the armory, filled with gleaming weapons and suits of armor, the stables, housing a magnificent collection of war horses, the chapel, small and austere, with a single stained glass window depicting a warrior saint. He spoke little, allowing the castle itself to speak for him, to convey its history, its strength, its unwavering loyalty to the Warwick lineage. Finally, he led her to her chambers, a large, sparsely furnished room overlooking the moor. A fire had been lit in the hearth, casting a warm glow on the stone walls. A heavy four-poster bed, draped with thick velvet curtains, dominated the room. A single window, small and narrow, offered a view of the bleak, wind-swept landscape. "These are your chambers," Warwick said, his voice echoing slightly in the stillness. "If you require anything, you need only ask." Marjorie turned to face him, her back to the fire. The flickering light played across his features, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw, the deep lines around his eyes. He looked tired, she realized, older than his years. The weight of his responsibilities, the burden of his past, seemed to rest heavily upon him. "Why did you marry me?" she asked, the question bursting forth before she could stop it. It was a question that had been gnawing at her all day, a question that demanded an answer. He met her gaze, his gray eyes unwavering. "You know why," he said, his voice low and husky. "To secure peace between our families. To end the bloodshed." "But there were other ways," she persisted. "Other alliances you could have forged." He took a step closer, his presence filling the room. "Perhaps," he conceded, "but none that would have been as effective." His gaze lingered on her face, his eyes tracing the curve of her cheek, the line of her jaw. She felt a blush rise to her cheeks, a heat that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. "You are beautiful," he said, the words unexpected, almost hesitant. It was not a courtly compliment, but a simple statement of fact, spoken with a sincerity that took her breath away. She looked away, unnerved by his intensity, by the sudden, inexplicable vulnerability she saw in his eyes. "Beauty is a fleeting thing, my lord," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It will not hold your interest for long." He reached out and gently touched her chin, tilting her face up to meet his. "Perhaps you underestimate your own worth, my lady," he said, his voice a low murmur. "And perhaps you underestimate my patience." He leaned closer, his breath warm on her cheek. She could smell the faint scent of wood smoke and leather, a scent that was both masculine and comforting. Her heart was pounding so hard, she thought he must surely hear it. She knew she should pull away, should resist, should remind him of the chasm that separated them. But she found herself unable to move, unable to break the spell that had fallen over them. He did not kiss her. He simply held her gaze, his eyes searching hers, as if seeking an answer to a question he had not yet asked. And in that moment, surrounded by the cold, unyielding stone of Warwick Castle, surrounded by the echoes of oaths sworn and battles fought, Lady Marjorie felt the first fragile tendrils of something unexpected begin to take root within her. Something that felt dangerously like hope. It was a perilous feeling. She had to either nurture it or destroy it. The unknown was much scarier than the expected. Chapter 3. Echoes of Winthorn. The days that followed settled into a strange, uneasy rhythm. Marjorie explored the castle, familiarizing herself with its labyrinthine corridors, its hidden staircases, its echoing chambers. It was a world away from Winthorne, yet there were moments, fleeting glimpses, that stirred a painful longing for her former home. The scent of herbs drying in the kitchen garden, the sight of a tapestry depicting a familiar landscape, the sound of a lute being played in the great hall, all these things evoked memories of a life that was lost to her, a life of carefree laughter and sun-drenched days. She found solace in the castle library, a small, dusty room filled with ancient tomes and scrolls. It was a refuge from the watchful eyes of the court, a place where she could lose herself in the words of others, in the stories of long-ago lives. She discovered a collection of poems, beautifully illustrated with delicate ink drawings, that spoke of love and loss, of longing and hope. They resonated with her own unspoken emotions, her own yearning for a connection that went beyond the constraints of duty and obligation. She also spent time in the chapel, seeking comfort in the quiet solitude, in the familiar rituals of prayer. She prayed for strength, for guidance, for the ability to navigate the treacherous currents of her new life. She prayed for her family, for their safety and well-being. And, hesitantly, she began to pray for her husband, for the man who was both her captor and her protector. Warwick remained a distant, enigmatic figure. He was often absent, attending to the affairs of his vast estate, meeting with his advisors, overseeing the training of his men. When he was present, he was polite, courteous, even considerate. He made sure she had everything she needed, that she was comfortable, that she was treated with respect by the castle staff. But he kept his distance, maintaining a careful reserve that she found both frustrating and intriguing. She observed him closely, studying his interactions with his men, his demeanor in court, his quiet moments of reflection. She saw the respect he commanded, the loyalty he inspired. She saw the burden of leadership he carried, the weight of his responsibilities. She saw the glimpses of weariness, the shadows of past sorrows that flickered in his eyes. One evening, she found him in the library, standing by the window, gazing out at the darkening landscape. He was not aware of her presence, and she hesitated, unsure whether to intrude. He looked vulnerable, somehow, stripped of his usual armor of command. She cleared her throat softly, and he turned, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "My lady," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I did not hear you enter." I often come here," she said, gesturing to the shelves of books. "It is a place of peace." He nodded, his gaze returning to the window. "It is," he agreed, "a refuge from the storms of the world." A silence fell between them, a silence filled with unspoken emotions, with the weight of their shared history, their uncertain future. "Do you ever miss Winthorne?" he asked, the question unexpected, almost hesitant. She was surprised by his perceptiveness, by his willingness to acknowledge her loss. "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "Every day." He turned to face her, his gray eyes searching hers. "I know I cannot replace what you have lost," he said, his voice sincere. "But I will do everything in my power to make this a home for you." The words were simple, yet they carried a weight of meaning that resonated deep within her. It was not an apology, not a promise of love, but an acknowledgement of her pain, a pledge of his commitment to her well-being. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. He took a step closer, his presence filling the small room. "There are gardens here," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Not as grand as Winthorne's, perhaps, but pleasant enough. Would you like to see them?" She nodded, her heart beating a little faster. It was a small gesture, an offer of companionship, a crack in the wall that separated them. He led her out of the library and down a narrow corridor to a small, enclosed garden. It was sheltered from the wind, and the air was still and fragrant with the scent of herbs and late-blooming roses. A stone fountain gurgled softly in the center, and a few benches were scattered amongst the flower beds. They walked in silence for a while, the only sound the gentle splashing of the fountain and the rustling of leaves. Marjorie felt a sense of calm settle over her, a peace she had not experienced since leaving Winthorne. "My mother loved gardens," Warwick said, his voice breaking the silence. She spent many hours here, tending to the flowers, finding solace in their beauty. Marjorie looked at him, surprised by this glimpse into his past, into his personal life. Did she die here? She asked hesitantly. He nodded. She was taken ill suddenly. A fever. There was nothing the physicians could do. She saw the flicker of pain in his eyes, the shadow of grief that still lingered. She reached out and touched his arm, a gesture of comfort, of shared sorrow. I am sorry, she said, her voice sincere. He looked at her, his gaze intense, unreadable. It was a long time ago, he said, his voice husky. But some wounds never fully heal. The unspoken words hung between them, a shared understanding of loss, of the enduring power of grief. And in that moment, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the garden, surrounded by the echoes of Winthorne and the ghosts of Warwick's past, Lady Marjorie felt another fragile connection form between them. A connection forged not in duty or obligation, but in shared humanity, in the shared experience of pain and loss. The future was still uncertain, the path ahead still fraught with peril. But for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, she could find a place for herself in this new life, a place beside the man who was both her enemy and her husband. Or maybe a reason not to think of him as her enemy anymore. Chapter 4. The Hawk and the Dove. The following weeks saw a subtle shift in the dynamic between Marjorie and Edmund. He began to seek her out, inviting her to join him on rides across the moor, sharing meals with her in the great hall, even engaging her in conversations about the running of the estate. He treated her with a growing respect, a deference that went beyond the formal courtesy due to a wife. He listened to her opinions, valued her insights, and even, on occasion, sought her advice. Marjorie, in turn, found herself responding to his overtures. She began to see beyond the stern exterior, beyond the reputation of the ruthless warrior. She saw the intelligence in his eyes, the quiet humor that occasionally surfaced, the deep sense of responsibility he carried. She saw the loneliness that haunted him, the yearning for connection that mirrored her own. One crisp autumn afternoon, Edmund invited her to watch him train with his men in the courtyard. She accepted, curious to see this other side of him, the warrior in his element. She sat on a raised platform, overlooking the training yard, a fur cloak wrapped around her shoulders to ward off the chill wind. Below her, the courtyard was a scene of controlled chaos. Men at arms sparred with swords and shields, the clang of steel echoing off the stone walls. Squires practiced archery, their arrows thudding into targets. And in the center of it all, Edmund moved with a grace and power that took her breath away. He wore a simple leather jerkin and breeches, his dark hair unbound and falling to his shoulders. He held a practice sword in his hand, its blade dulled for safety, but even so, he wielded it with a deadly precision, a mastery born of years of training and experience. He moved like a predator, swift and agile, his every movement calculated, his every strike precise. She watched him spar with Lord Edric, his uncle, the older man holding his own surprisingly well against Edmund's relentless attacks. Their swords clashed, their bodies collided, their grunts and shouts mingling with the clang of steel. It was a brutal, balletic dance, a display of skill and strength that was both mesmerizing and disturbing. After the sparring session, Edmund came to her, his face flushed, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was sweating, his hair plastered to his forehead, but his eyes were bright, alive with the thrill of the exercise. "Did you enjoy the display, my lady?" he asked, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. Marjorie found herself returning his smile. "It was impressive," she admitted. "You are a skilled warrior." He shrugged, a gesture of modesty that seemed at odds with his formidable presence. "It is a necessary skill in these times," he said. "A lord must be able to defend his lands, his people." "And his wife?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. His smile faded, replaced by a serious expression. "Especially his wife," he said, his voice low and intense. "I will protect you, Marjorie. I swear it." The words, spoken with such conviction, sent a shiver down her spine. It was not a romantic declaration, but a pledge of protection, a warrior's vow. And yet, it stirred something deep within her, a sense of security, of belonging that she had not expected to feel. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers calloused but gentle. He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. It was a courtly gesture, a formal acknowledgement of her status, but the warmth of his lips lingered on her skin, sending a wave of heat through her. "You remind me of a hawk," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Strong, fierce, and unyielding." He chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. "And you, my lady," he said, his eyes twinkling, "are like a dove. Gentle, graceful, and surprisingly resilient." The image, the contrast between them, was striking. The hawk and the dove, predator and prey, warrior and peacemaker. Yet somehow it felt right. They were different, yes, but their differences, their strengths and weaknesses, seemed to complement each other, to create a balance, a harmony. As they stood there, hand in hand, overlooking the bustling courtyard, Marjorie realized that the walls between them were slowly crumbling. The animosity, the distrust, the fear, all these things were still present, but they were no longer the defining elements of their relationship. Something else was emerging, something fragile and tentative, but something that held the promise of connection, of understanding, of perhaps even love. And in that moment, amidst the clang of steel and the shouts of men, Lady Marjorie felt a flicker of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, the hawk and the dove could learn to fly together. But she had to remind herself that he was still Lord Warwick. Her family's downfall, even though not directly his fault at least, that's what he claimed, was still fresh in many people's memories, her own included. Would she, ever truly move past that? Chapter 5. A cold hearth, a warming gaze. Autumn deepened, painting the moors in hues of russet and gold. The days grew shorter, the nights longer, and a persistent chill settled over Warwick Castle. The great hall, despite the roaring fire in the hearth, often felt cold, the vast space echoing with the ghosts of past gatherings, past merriment. Marjorie found herself spending more time in her chambers, seeking warmth and solitude. One evening, as she sat by the fire, embroidering a tapestry, she heard a knock on her door. It was Edmund, his face drawn, his eyes shadowed with weariness. "May I enter, my lady?" he asked, his voice hesitant. She nodded, her heart beating a little faster. He rarely sought her out in her chambers, preferring to maintain a respectful distance. He entered, closing the door behind him. He stood for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the room, taking in the fire and the hearth, the tapestries on the walls, the books scattered on a small table. "It is warmer in here than in the great hall," he said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "The fire helps," she replied, returning his smile. "But the hall is vast. It takes a lot to heat it." He nodded, his gaze settling on her. "You seem content," he observed. "Are you settling in?" She hesitated, unsure how to answer. She was settling in, yes, but it was not a simple process. There were still moments of loneliness, of longing for Winthorne, of resentment towards him. But there were also moments of peace, of contentment, of a growing sense of belonging. "I am finding my way," she said, choosing her words carefully. "It is not easy, but it is bearable." He took a step closer, his presence filling the room. "I know it is not what you wanted," he said, his voice low and sincere. "This marriage, this life. But I hope you can find some happiness here." His words, spoken with such honesty, touched her. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the genuine concern for her well-being. "I am trying," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It is easier, now, with you." He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the curve of her jaw. "You are stronger than you think, Marjorie," he said, his voice a low murmur. "You have endured much, and you will thrive." His touch sent a wave of heat through her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. She looked up at him, her eyes meeting his, and she saw something there that she had not seen before.
O tenderness, o vulnerability, o desire.
He leaned closer, his breath warm on her cheek. She could smell the faint scent of wood smoke and leather, a scent that had become familiar, comforting. Her heart was pounding so hard, she thought he must surely hear it. He did not kiss her. He simply held her gaze, his eyes searching hers, as if seeking permission, as if waiting for a sign. And in that moment, surrounded by the flickering firelight, surrounded by the warmth of his presence, Marjorie felt all her resistance, all her doubts, all her fears, begin to melt away. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines of his jaw, the stubble of his beard. He closed his eyes, a sigh escaping his lips. "Marjorie," he whispered, her name a plea, a question, a prayer. She leaned in and pressed her lips to his. It was a tentative kiss, a hesitant exploration, a meeting of two souls long separated by duty and circumstance. But it was also a kiss of surrender, of acceptance, of a burgeoning desire that could no longer be denied. He responded with a passion that surprised her, his arms encircling her, drawing her close. His kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more demanding. She met his passion with her own, her arms wrapping around his neck, her fingers tangling in his hair. The kiss lasted for an eternity, a timeless moment of connection, of shared longing, of a love that was slowly, tentatively, beginning to blossom. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, their eyes shining with a mixture of surprise and joy. He began, his voice husky, his words faltering. "Don't," she whispered, placing a finger on his lips. "Don't say anything." She didn't want words, not yet. She wanted this feeling, this moment of pure, unadulterated connection. She wanted to savor the warmth of his embrace, the taste of his kiss, the feeling of his heart beating against hers. He understood. He simply held her close, his arms wrapped tightly around her, his cheek resting against her hair. And in that moment, in the warmth of her chambers, in the flickering firelight, Lady Marjorie felt a sense of peace, of belonging, of love, that she had never thought possible. The cold hearth of her heart had begun to warm, warmed by the gaze, the touch, the kiss of the man she had once considered her enemy. And tonight, she didn't have to consider the future or the consequences. She had tonight, and it was enough. Or so she told herself. Chapter 6. Scars of the Past. The intimacy that had blossomed between Marjorie and Edmund did not vanish with the dawn. It lingered, a subtle undercurrent in their interactions, a warmth in their gazes, a tenderness in their touch. They began to share more of themselves, revealing their hopes, their fears, their dreams. They talked late into the night, huddled by the fire in Marjorie's chambers, sharing stories of their childhoods, their families, their pasts. It was during one of these conversations that Edmund finally spoke of the events that had led to the downfall of Winthorne. It was a story he had avoided, a subject he had been reluctant to broach. But Marjorie had insisted, needing to understand, needing to hear his version of the truth. "Your father," he began, his voice heavy with regret, "was a proud man, a stubborn man. He refused to bend to the king's demands, refused to pay the taxes that were levied on his lands. He believed they were unjust," Marjorie interjected, her voice tight with emotion. "He believed he was being punished for his loyalty to the previous king." Edmund nodded. He may have been right, he conceded, but he was also foolish. He underestimated the king's ruthlessness, his determination to crush any opposition. "And you were the king's instrument," Marjorie said, her voice laced with bitterness. Edmund flinched, as if struck by her words. "I was a soldier," he said, his voice low and defensive. "I followed orders. I had no choice." "You always have a choice," Marjorie countered. "You could have refused. You could have helped us." He shook his head. "It was not that simple," he said. "Refusal would have meant treason. It would have meant my own ruin. And it would not have saved Winthorne. The king would have found someone else to carry out his orders." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and regret.
I did what I thought was necessary, he said. To protect my own people, my own lands. To survive.
And what of my brothers? Marjorie asked, her voice trembling. Did you think of them? Did you think of the lives you were destroying? Edmund's face was pale, his expression haunted. Your brothers, they fought bravely, he said, his voice barely a whisper. They died with honor.
Honor?
Marjorie scoffed. What honor is there in dying for a king's greed? What honor is there in being slaughtered like animals? He reached out and took her hand, his fingers gripping hers tightly. I know I cannot undo what was done, he said, his voice sincere. I cannot bring back your brothers. I cannot erase your pain. But I regret it, Marjorie. More than you know. She looked at him, searching his eyes for any hint of deception, any trace of the ruthless warrior she had once believed him to be. But she found only sorrow, only regret, only a profound weariness that mirrored her own. I believe you, she said, her voice hesitant. But it is hard to forgive. He nodded. I do not expect forgiveness, he said. Only understanding. Perhaps acceptance. He released her hand and stood up, walking over to the window. He gazed out at the darkened landscape, his shoulders slumped, his body tense. I have scars, Marjorie, he said, his voice barely audible. Scars you cannot see. Scars of war, of loss, of guilt. They haunt me. They remind me of the things I have done, the choices I have made. He turned to face her, his eyes filled with a vulnerability she had never seen before. I am not a monster, he said, his voice pleading. But I am flawed. I am damaged. She stood up and walked over to him, placing a hand on his arm. We all have scars, Edmund, she said, her voice soft. We all carry the burdens of our past. It is what we do with them that matters. He looked at her, his gaze searching hers. And what do you do with yours, Marjorie? He asked. How do you cope? She smiled, a sad, wistful smile. I remember, she said. I remember the good times, the happy memories. I remember the love I shared with my family, with my brothers. And I try to find hope in the future. In us. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the curve of her jaw. You are remarkable, he said, his voice a low murmur. You have a strength, a resilience, that I admire. He leaned in and kissed her, a gentle, tender kiss that spoke of gratitude, of respect, of a growing love that was slowly healing the wounds of their pasts. It was a kiss that acknowledged their scars, their flaws, their shared humanity. As they stood there, embraced in the flickering firelight, Marjorie realized that forgiveness was not a single act, but a process, a journey. It was a journey she was willing to take, a journey she was taking with the man who had once been her enemy, but who was now, slowly, surely, becoming her love. She knew there were more ghosts to confront, and there was always the fear of relapse into being enemies. But for the first time, she felt a hope that maybe true peace was not just a strategic tool. Chapter 7. The Whispers of Court. News of the warming relationship between Lord and Lady Warwick spread through the castle like wildfire. Servants whispered in the corridors, knights exchanged knowing glances in the training yard, and the ladies of the court gossiped in hushed tones over their embroidery. Not everyone was pleased. Lord Edric, Edmund's uncle, was particularly concerned. He had served as Edmund's advisor and confidant for many years, guiding him through the treacherous waters of court politics, helping him secure his position as one of the most powerful lords in the realm. He had initially supported the marriage to Marjorie as a strategic alliance, a way to consolidate Warwick's power and quell the unrest in the region. But he had not anticipated the genuine affection that had blossomed between them. He voiced his concerns to Edmund one evening as they sat in Edmund's private solar, reviewing the accounts of the estate. You are becoming too close to the girl, Edmund, Edric said, his voice gruff with disapproval. It is unwise. Edmund looked up from the ledgers, his expression guarded. She is my wife, Edric, he said. It is natural that we should grow closer. She is the daughter of your enemy, Edric reminded him. The sister of the men you killed. Do not forget that. Edmund's jaw tightened. I have not forgotten, he said, his voice tight with emotion. But she is not her father. She is not her brothers. She is different. She is a Windthorn, Edric insisted. And the Windthorns are known for their treachery. They will use you, Edmund. They will betray you. Edmund shook his head. You are wrong, Edric, he said. Marjorie is honest. She is loyal. She would not betray me. Edric sighed, his expression softening slightly. I hope you are right, Edmund, he said. For your sake. But I fear you are letting your heart rule your head. And that is a dangerous thing for a lord. Edmund did not reply. He returned his attention to the ledgers, but his mind was elsewhere. He knew Edric's concerns were not entirely unfounded. There were risks involved in trusting Marjorie, in allowing himself to love her. But he could not help himself. He was drawn to her, captivated by her strength, her resilience, her beauty. He had found something in her that he had not found in anyone else, something that he had long craved: a connection, a companionship, a love that transcended the boundaries of duty and obligation. The whispers of court, however, were not limited to Edric's concerns. There were other voices, other agendas at play. Lady Annalise, a distant cousin of Edmund's, a woman known for her beauty and her ambition, had long harbored a desire for Edmund. She had hoped to become his wife, to share in his power and prestige. She was not pleased to see Marjorie take her place. She began to spread rumors, to sow seeds of doubt, to undermine Marjorie's position at court. She whispered of Marjorie's past, of her family's treachery, of her supposed lingering resentment towards Edmund. She hinted at secret meetings, at clandestine correspondence, at plots against Warwick's life. Marjorie was aware of the whispers, of the veiled insults, of the subtle attempts to isolate her. She felt the eyes of the court upon her, judging her, questioning her, waiting for her to make a mistake. It was a lonely, isolating experience, a constant reminder of her precarious position, of the fragility of her newfound happiness. She confided in Edmund, sharing her fears, her anxieties, her frustrations. He listened patiently, offering words of comfort, of reassurance, of support. Do not let them get to you, Marjorie, he said, his voice gentle but firm. They are jealous. They are afraid of you. Afraid of me? Marjorie scoffed. Why should they be afraid of me? Because you are strong, he said. Because you are different. Because you have my affection. And that makes you a threat. He took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. I will protect you, Marjorie, he said, his voice sincere. I will not let them harm you. His words, his touch, gave her strength, gave her courage. She knew she was not alone. She had Edmund by her side, her husband, her protector, her love. And she would not let the whispers of court, the machinations of her enemies, destroy what they had found together. She was not the timid dove he had once believed her. She was discovering a strength, a boldness that would defend what she loved, and she would not shy away from the challenges ahead. The first of these would be Lady Annalise. It was time for a confrontation, however subtle it must be. Chapter 8. A Dance of Deception. Marjorie decided to confront Lady Annalise directly, but subtly. She would not stoop to Annalise's level of whispered accusations and veiled insults. She would use her wit, her intelligence, her newfound confidence to expose Annalise's machinations and put an end to her poisonous rumors. She chose a public occasion, a feast in the great hall, to make her move. The hall was filled with guests, the long tables laden with food and drink, the air buzzing with conversation and laughter. Marjorie, dressed in a gown of deep blue velvet, her hair adorned with a simple silver circlet, sat beside Edmund at the high table. She was acutely aware of Annalise's presence across the room, her eyes constantly darting towards them, her expression a mixture of envy and malice. During a lull in the conversation, Marjorie turned to Edmund, her voice clear and carrying. My lord, she said, I have been hearing some disturbing rumors. Edmund raised an eyebrow, his expression curious. Rumors, my lady? He asked. What rumors are these? Marjorie glanced across the room at Annalise, her eyes meeting hers for a brief moment. Annalise's face paled slightly, but she held Marjorie's gaze, a defiant smirk playing on her lips. "Rumors that I am unhappy here," Marjorie said, her voice laced with a hint of amusement. "That I resent my marriage. That I long for my former life." Edmund frowned. "These are false rumors, surely," he said, his voice firm. "You have given me no reason to believe such things." "Indeed," Marjorie agreed. "But some people, it seems, prefer to believe the worst. They prefer to stir up trouble. They prefer to sow discord." She paused, letting her words hang in the air, letting the implications sink in. The hall had grown quieter, the guests listening intently, sensing the tension between Marjorie and Annalise. "I would never betray your trust, my lord," Marjorie continued, her voice sincere. "I am grateful for your kindness, your generosity, your protection. I am content here. With you." She reached out and took Edmund's hand, her fingers interlacing with his. He squeezed her hand, his eyes meeting hers, conveying his trust, his affection, his love. Annalise, her face now flushed with anger, could no longer contain herself. "You are a liar, Marjorie," she spat out, her voice shrill. "You are a deceiver. You are playing a game." Marjorie smiled, a cool, confident smile that infuriated Annalise even more. "A game, my lady?" she asked. "What game is that?" "The game of seduction," Annalise said, her voice dripping with venom. "You are trying to ensnare my Lord Edmund. You are trying to steal him from me." A gasp went through the hall. Annalise had gone too far. She had openly accused Marjorie of treachery, of infidelity, of trying to usurp her position. Edmund rose from his seat, his face a mask of fury. "Enough, Annalise," he said, his voice thundering through the hall. "You will apologize to my wife." Immediately. Annalise, realizing her mistake, stammered. But my lord, apologize," Edmund repeated, his voice cold and menacing. Annalise, cowed by Edmund's anger, lowered her head. I apologize, Lady Marjorie," she mumbled, her voice barely audible. Marjorie inclined her head, accepting the apology with a grace that belied her inner turmoil. "Apology accepted, Lady Annalise," she said, her voice calm and composed. "But I suggest you choose your words more carefully in the future." The tension in the hall slowly dissipated. The guests resumed their conversations, but the incident had not been forgotten. Marjorie had won the battle. She had exposed Annalise's lies, defended her honor, and reaffirmed her position as Edmund's wife. Edmund, his anger subsided, sat down beside Marjorie. He took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. "You were magnificent," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "You handled her perfectly." Marjorie smiled. "I learned from the best," she said, her eyes meeting his. "I learned from you." He leaned in and kissed her, a brief, tender kiss that spoke volumes. It was a kiss of gratitude, of respect, of a love that was growing stronger with each passing day. It was a kiss that silenced the whispers of court, that defied the machinations of their enemies, that proclaimed their unity to the world. It was also a silent promise. She had protected him, now, and he would always, always protect her. It wasn't simply an oath anymore. It was something deeper, something unshakable. But could it withstand the pressures from outside the castle walls? Chapter 9. The Price of Loyalty. The peace that Marjorie and Edmund had found was shattered by the arrival of a royal messenger. He bore a summons from the king, demanding Edmund's presence at court, along with a contingent of his men-at-arms. The king was preparing for war, a campaign against a rebellious northern lord who had refused to pay homage and was threatening to secede from the realm. Edmund was reluctant to leave Marjorie, especially after the recent incident with Annalise. He knew that court was a dangerous place, filled with intrigue and treachery, and he feared for her safety. But he also knew that he could not refuse the king's summons. It would be seen as an act of defiance, of disloyalty, and could have dire consequences. He broke the news to Marjorie gently, explaining the situation, assuring her that he would return as soon as possible. "I do not like this, Edmund," Marjorie said, her voice filled with apprehension. "I fear for you. I fear for us." "I know," Edmund said, his voice soothing. "But I have no choice. I must go."
It is my duty. And what of my duty? Marjorie asked. To remain here alone, vulnerable to the whispers of court, to the machinations of your enemies? Edmund took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. You will not be alone, he said. I will leave Edric in charge. He will protect you. And I will send word regularly. I will keep you informed. Edric, Marjorie said, her voice hesitant. I do not trust him entirely, Edmund. He does not like me. Edmund sighed. Edric is loyal to me, he said. He may not approve of our relationship, but he will obey my orders. He will keep you safe. Marjorie was not convinced, but she knew she could not dissuade Edmund. He was determined to go, to fulfill his duty to the king, to protect his lands and his people. The day of Edmund's departure was a somber one. The castle was filled with a sense of unease, of foreboding. Marjorie stood in the courtyard, watching as Edmund mounted his warhorse, his men at arms gathered around him, their faces grim, their weapons gleaming in the morning sun. Edmund rode over to her, leaning down from his saddle to kiss her farewell. It was a long, passionate kiss, a kiss that spoke of love, of longing, of a desperate hope for a safe return. I will come back to you, Marjorie, he said, his voice husky with emotion. I swear it. And I will be waiting, Marjorie replied, her voice trembling. Godspeed, my lord. Godspeed. He spurred his horse and rode away, leading his men out of the castle gates and across the moor. Marjorie watched them go, her heart heavy with sorrow, her mind filled with fear. She felt a sense of isolation, of vulnerability, that she had not felt since the early days of her marriage. As she turned to walk back into the castle, she saw Edric standing in the doorway, watching her. His expression was unreadable, but she sensed a coldness in his eyes, a lack of sympathy that chilled her to the bone. He is gone, Edric said, his voice devoid of emotion. And now, you are under my protection, Lady Marjorie. I suggest you behave yourself. His words were a veiled threat, a reminder of her precarious position, of the power he held over her. She met his gaze, her chin lifted, her eyes defiant. I am not afraid of you, Lord Edric, she said, her voice firm. And I will not be intimidated. I am Edmund's wife, and I will conduct myself with the dignity and honor that befits my station. Edric smirked, a cruel, dismissive smirk that made her blood boil. We shall see, my lady, he said. We shall see. He turned and walked away, leaving Marjorie standing alone in the courtyard, feeling the weight of his animosity, the chill of his unspoken threat. She knew that the coming weeks would be a test, a trial. She would have to be strong, resilient, resourceful. She would have to navigate the treacherous currents of court politics, the machinations of her enemies, the loneliness of Edmund's absence. She would have to survive. For herself. For Edmund. For the fragile hope of a future together. But Edric's open hostility was just the beginning. She could feel something brewing. Something dangerous. And without Edmund, she felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. Chapter 10. Beneath the Armor. Edric's guardianship proved to be as oppressive as Marjorie had feared. He restricted her movements, limited her access to information, and treated her with a barely concealed contempt. He seemed to take pleasure in reminding her of her vulnerability, of her dependence on his goodwill. He controlled the household, the guards, even the flow of information from the outside world. Letters from Edmund were infrequent and brief, providing little comfort or reassurance. He wrote of battles fought, of victories won, of the hardships of the campaign. He expressed his longing for her, his concern for her safety, but his words felt distant, impersonal, overshadowed by the weight of his responsibilities. Marjorie found herself increasingly isolated, confined to her chambers, spending her days reading, embroidering, and praying for Edmund's safe return. She missed his presence, his warmth, his counsel. She missed the feeling of security, of belonging, that he had given her. One evening, as she sat by the fire, lost in thought, she heard a soft knock on her door. It was not Edric, nor one of the servants. It was Sir Callan, one of Edmund's most trusted knights, a man known for his loyalty, his courage,
and his discretion. He had been left behind to oversee the castle's defenses, and Marjorie had always found him to be courteous and respectful, unlike many of the other men. "My lady," Kaelin said, bowing low. "May I have a word?" Marjorie, surprised by his unexpected visit, nodded. "Of course, Sir Kaelin. Please enter." Kaelin entered, closing the door behind him. He looked around the room as if checking for eavesdroppers, before turning to face her. "I have concerns, my lady," he said, his voice low and serious. "About Lord Edric." Marjorie's heart skipped a beat. "Concerns?" she asked. "What concerns?" "He is restricting your movements," Kaelin said. "He is controlling the flow of information. He is treating you with disrespect." Marjorie sighed. "I know," she said. He does not like me." "It is more than that, my lady," Kaelin said. "I believe he suspects you of treachery." Marjorie's eyes widened in shock. "Treachery?" she exclaimed. "But that is absurd. I am Edmund's wife. I would never betray him." Kaelin nodded. "I know that, my lady," he said. "But Edric, he is blinded by his prejudice. He sees you as a Windthorn, as an enemy. He does not trust you." "But what can I do?" Marjorie asked, her voice filled with despair. "Edmund is gone. I am at Edric's mercy." Kaelin hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "There is something you should know, my lady," he said. "Something that Lord Edmund entrusted to me." Before he left, he reached into his tunic and pulled out a small, sealed letter. "He told me to give this to you," he said, "only if I believed you were in danger. Only if I believed Edric was acting against your interests." Marjorie took the letter, her hands trembling. Her name was written on the outside, in Edmund's familiar handwriting. She broke the seal and unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning the words quickly. The letter was brief, but its contents were shocking. Edmund wrote of his suspicions about Edric, of his fears that his uncle might try to use Marjorie as a pawn in a power struggle, that he might even try to harm her. He instructed Marjorie to trust Kaelin, to follow his advice, and to flee the castle if necessary. He had made arrangements, secret passages known only to him and Kaelin, a safe haven where she could find refuge. Marjorie looked up at Kaelin, her eyes filled with tears. He knew," she whispered. "He knew Edric was a threat." Kaelin nodded. "He did," he said. "And he loves you, my lady. More than you know. He would do anything to protect you." "But what should I do?" Marjorie asked, her voice trembling. "Should I flee?" Kaelin considered for a moment. "Not yet," he said. "Not unless it becomes absolutely necessary. Edric has not made a direct move against you. Fleeing now would only confirm his suspicions. It would make you look guilty. But what if he tries to?" Marjorie could not bring herself to say the words. "I will not let him harm you, my lady," Kaelin said, his voice firm. "I swear it. I will protect you. With my life." His words, his loyalty, his unwavering support gave her strength, gave her courage. She was not alone. She had Kaelin, a true knight, a man who honored his oaths, a man who would stand by her side, even in the face of danger. "Thank you, Sir Kaelin," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. I do not know what I would do without you." He bowed his head. "It is my honor, my lady," he said, "to serve you, to serve Lord Edmund." He left her then, leaving her alone with Edmund's letter, with the weight of his love, with the knowledge of his foresight, with the fragile hope of a future that was still uncertain, still fraught with peril. But now, she had a secret weapon, a hidden ally. She had Kaelin, and she had the knowledge that Edmund, even from afar, was still protecting her. He had seen beneath Edric's armor, and now, so had she. But knowing was only half the battle. Surviving was the other. And she had a growing suspicion that Edric was far more dangerous than even Edmund had anticipated. Chapter 11. Seeds of Rebellion. The following days were filled with a tense, unspoken battle of wills between Marjorie and Edric. He continued to restrict her movements, to monitor her correspondence, to treat her with barely disguised contempt. She, in turn, maintained a calm, dignified demeanor, refusing to be intimidated, refusing to give him any reason to openly accuse her of anything. She relied on Kaelin for information, for support, for a sense of connection to the outside world. Kaelin, through his network of contacts within the castle and the surrounding villages, began to uncover disturbing rumors. Rumors of Edric's growing dissatisfaction with Edmund's rule, of his secret meetings with other disgruntled lords, of his ambitions. It seemed that Edric was not merely content with controlling Warwick Castle in Edmund's absence. He was plotting something more, something far more dangerous. Kaelin shared his findings with Marjorie, his voice grave, his expression worried. "I believe Edric is planning a rebellion, my lady," he said. "He intends to overthrow Lord Edmund, to seize control of his lands, his title, his power." Marjorie was shocked, but not entirely surprised. She had sensed Edric's animosity, his resentment, his greed. She had known he was a threat, but she had not realized the extent of his treachery. "But how?" she asked. "Edmund is the rightful lord. He has the support of the king. He has loyal men. Edric is cultivating allies," Kaelin explained. "He is playing on the discontents of other lords, promising them land, wealth, power. He is sowing seeds of rebellion." "And what of the king?" Marjorie asked. "Will he not intervene? Will he not protect Edmund?" Kaelin shook his head. "The king is distracted," he said. "He is focused on the war in the north. He is relying on his lords to maintain order in their own regions. He would not welcome news of another rebellion." "So Edric believes he can get away with it," Marjorie said, her voice filled with anger. "He believes he can betray Edmund with impunity." "He is counting on it," Kaelin said. "He believes that by the time the king learns of his treachery, it will be too late. He will have consolidated his power. He will be unstoppable." Marjorie felt a surge of determination, a fierce resolve to protect Edmund, to defend his lands, to thwart Edric's plans. She would not allow Edric to succeed. She would not let him betray the man she loved, the man who had entrusted her with his life, his honor, his future. "We must do something, Kaelin," she said, her voice firm. "We must stop him." "But how, my lady?" Kaelin asked. "We are outnumbered. We are outmaneuvered. We have few resources." Marjorie thought for a moment, her mind racing. She remembered Edmund's letter, his instructions to flee if necessary, his mention of a safe haven. But fleeing was not an option, not yet. She would not abandon Edmund's people, his lands, to Edric's tyranny. She would fight. "We must warn Edmund," she said. "We must inform him of Edric's treachery. We must give him a chance to return, to defend his rights." "But how?" Kaelin asked. "Edric controls all communication. He intercepts all letters. He monitors all messengers." Marjorie smiled, a determined, almost defiant smile. "Not all," she said. "There is one messenger he cannot control. One messenger he cannot intercept." She thought of the falcons, the trained hunting birds that Edmund kept in the mews. They were swift, agile, capable of flying long distances, of carrying messages undetected. "We will use the falcons, Kaelin," she said. "We will send a message to Edmund. A message that Edric will not expect. A message that will alert him to the danger. A message that will bring him home." It was a risky plan, a desperate gamble. But it was their only hope. They had to act quickly, before Edric could consolidate his power, before he could launch his rebellion. They had to warn Edmund, to give him a chance to fight back, to reclaim his rightful place. The seeds of rebellion had been sown, but Marjorie was determined to prevent them from taking root. She would be the hawk, now, carrying a message of warning, a message of love, a message of defiance. The success, and their very lives, rested on the wings of a bird. Chapter 12. A Knight's Confession. Preparing the message for the falcon was a delicate and dangerous task. Marjorie wrote a brief, coded letter, outlining Edric's treachery and urging Edmund to return with all haste. She used a cipher that she and Edmund had devised during their late-night conversations, a secret language based on the poems they had shared in the library. It was a language of love, of shared memories, of hidden meanings that only they would understand. Kaelin, skilled in falconry, selected the strongest, fastest bird, a magnificent peregrine falcon named Shadow. He carefully attached the tiny, rolled-up letter to the falcon's leg, using a thin leather thong. They released the falcon from Marjorie's chamber window at dawn, when the castle was still quiet, when Edric and his men were least likely to be watching. They watched as Shadow soared into the sky, circling once above the castle before heading north, towards the battlefields where Edmund was fighting. "Godspeed, Shadow," Marjorie whispered, her heart filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "Carry our message safely. Bring him home." The days that followed were filled with agonizing suspense. Marjorie and Kaelin waited anxiously for any sign of Edmund's return, any indication that the message had reached him. They continued their charade of normalcy, maintaining a calm, composed demeanor in front of Edric, while secretly preparing for the worst. Kaelin, through his network of contacts, gathered information about Edric's plans. He learned that Edric was planning to hold a Council of Lords, a gathering where he intended to formally declare his rebellion and claim the title of Lord Warwick. He was also amassing weapons and supplies, preparing for a siege, anticipating that Edmund would eventually return to challenge him. Marjorie knew that they had to act quickly, before Edric could consolidate his power, before he could launch his attack. She and Kaelin devised a plan, a desperate gamble to disrupt Edric's council, to expose his treachery, to buy time for Edmund's return. One evening, as they were discussing their plans in Marjorie's chambers, Kaelin hesitated, his expression troubled. "There is something I must tell you, my lady," he said, his voice low and hesitant. "Something I should have told you long ago." Marjorie looked at him, her heart beating faster. "What is it, Kaelin?"
she asked.
He took a deep breath, his eyes meeting hers. "I love you, my lady," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I have loved you since the first day I saw you." Marjorie was stunned. She had not expected this, had not anticipated his confession. She had always considered him a loyal friend, a trusted ally, but she had never thought of him as a suitor. "Kaelin," she began, her voice faltering. I do not know what to say." "You need say nothing, my lady," he said, his voice tinged with sadness. "I know it is impossible. You are Lord Edmund's wife, and I am but a knight, sworn to serve him." He looked away, his face flushed, his expression pained. I could not keep it to myself any longer," he said. "I had to tell you, before it was too late." Marjorie reached out and touched his arm, her heart filled with compassion. "Kaelin," she said, her voice soft, "I am honored by your feelings. You are a good man, a brave knight, a loyal friend. But my heart belongs to Edmund. I love him. I cannot offer you what you desire." He nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know, my lady," he said. "I understand. I will continue to serve you, to protect you, with my life, even if it means nothing to you." "It means everything to me, Kaelin," she said, her voice sincere. "Your loyalty, your friendship, your love. It means more than you know." She embraced him, a brief, comforting embrace that acknowledged his feelings, that honored his devotion, that reaffirmed their bond. It was a moment of shared vulnerability, of unspoken understanding, of a love that could never be, but that would always be cherished. When they broke apart, Kaelin's expression had changed. The sadness was still there, but it was tempered by a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to protect her, to serve her, to prove his worth, even if it meant sacrificing his own happiness. "We must focus on Edric, my lady," he said, his voice firm. "We must stop him. For Lord Edmund. For you." Marjorie nodded, her heart filled with gratitude, with respect, with a profound appreciation for the knight who had confessed his love, but who would continue to stand by her side, even in the face of unrequited desire. His love was different from Edmund's, but at that moment, she realized that the strength of it was equal. It was the confession, and her acceptance, that made her realize the danger they were both in now. If Edric discovered Kaelin's feelings, it could be a death sentence for both of them. Chapter 13. The Falcon's Flight. The day of Edric's council arrived, a day of reckoning, a day of high stakes. The great hall was filled with lords from across the region, men who had been swayed by Edric's promises, men who were eager to share in the spoils of his planned rebellion. Edric, dressed in Edmund's finest robes, sat at the high table, a smug, self-satisfied expression on his face. He was about to declare himself Lord Warwick, to formally usurp Edmund's title, to claim his lands and his power. Marjorie, dressed in a simple gown of dark gray, stood at the back of the hall, watching the proceedings with a mixture of anger and fear. Calen stood beside her, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, his eyes constantly scanning the room, alert for any sign of danger. Edric began his speech, his voice booming through the hall, outlining his grievances against Edmund, accusing him of weakness, of incompetence, of tyranny. He painted himself as a savior, a liberator, a leader who would restore order, justice, and prosperity to the region. The assembled lords listened intently, their faces reflecting a mixture of agreement and apprehension. Some were genuinely convinced by Edric's words, others were simply opportunistic, eager to profit from Edmund's downfall. As Edric reached the climax of his speech, about to declare himself the new Lord Warwick, a commotion erupted at the entrance to the hall. The doors burst open, and a figure strode in, his armor gleaming, his sword drawn, his face a mask of fury. It was Edmund. A gasp went through the hall. The assembled lords stared in disbelief, their faces paling, their hands instinctively reaching for their weapons. Edric, his face contorted with rage and disbelief, rose from his seat. "Edmund," he exclaimed. How did you?" Edmund ignored him. His eyes were fixed on Marjorie, his gaze filled with a mixture of relief, love, and fierce determination. "Marjorie," he said, his voice clear and strong, carrying through the hall. "Are you unharmed?" Marjorie rushed towards him, her heart overflowing with joy and relief. "Edmund," she cried, "you are alive. You are here." They embraced, a brief, passionate embrace that spoke volumes. It was a reunion, a reaffirmation of their love, a declaration of their unity in the face of treachery. Edric, recovering from his initial shock, found his voice. "You are a fool, Edmund," he snarled. "You have returned to your doom. You are outnumbered. You are outmaneuvered. You cannot win." Edmund turned to face his uncle, his expression cold and menacing. "I have returned to reclaim what is rightfully mine," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "My title, my lands, my wife. And I will not hesitate to punish those who have betrayed me." He raised his sword, the blade gleaming in the torchlight. "Those who stand with me," he shouted, "draw your swords. Those who stand with Edric, prepare to die." A moment of silence hung in the air, a tense, pregnant silence filled with uncertainty, with the looming threat of violence. Then, one by one, the lords began to make their choice. Some, loyal to Edmund, drew their swords and rallied to his side. Others, swayed by Edric's promises or intimidated by his power, remained seated, their faces pale, their expressions fearful. Calen, standing beside Marjorie, drew his sword, his eyes fixed on Edric. "For Lord Edmund," he shouted. "For Lady Marjorie. For justice." The battle was joined. The hall erupted in a chaos of clashing steel, shouts, and screams. Edmund fought with the fury of a cornered lion, his sword a blur of motion, cutting down those who dared to oppose him. Calen fought beside him, protecting Marjorie, defending his lord, his love, his honor. Marjorie, though unarmed, was not passive. She moved through the chaos, tending to the wounded, encouraging Edmund's men, rallying their spirits. She was a beacon of hope, a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of love in the face of betrayal. The fighting was fierce, brutal, bloody. But slowly, surely, Edmund's forces began to gain the upper hand. Edric's allies, seeing their hopes of victory fading, began to waver, to desert, to flee. Finally, Edric stood alone, surrounded by the bodies of his fallen men, his face contorted with rage and defeat. He faced Edmund, his sword raised in a last, desperate gesture of defiance. You may have won this battle, Edmund, he spat out, but you will not win the war. The king will punish you. He will crush you. Edmund lowered his sword, his expression filled with a mixture of pity and contempt. The king knows of your treachery, Edric, he said. He has disavowed you. He has condemned you. Edric's eyes widened in disbelief. How is that possible? He stammered. Edmund smiled, a cold, triumphant smile. A falcon, Edric, he said. A falcon carried a message of warning, a message of love. He gestured towards Marjorie, who stood beside him, her face radiant with pride and relief. My wife, Edric, he said. She is more resourceful than you ever imagined. She is more loyal than you ever deserved. Edric, his spirit broken, his ambitions shattered, dropped his sword. He fell to his knees, his head bowed in defeat. Edmund had won. He had reclaimed his title, his lands, his honor. He had defeated his treacherous uncle, thwarted his rebellion, secured his future. And he had done it all with the help of the woman he loved, the woman who had proven herself to be his equal, his partner, his soulmate. The falcon's flight had been successful, but the cost had been high, too high. Chapter 14. Threads of Treachery. The aftermath of the battle was a somber affair. The great hall, once a scene of feasting and merriment, was now a makeshift hospital filled with the groans of the wounded and the weeping of the bereaved. Edmund, though victorious, was deeply affected by the loss of life, by the betrayal of his uncle, by the realization of how close he had come to losing everything. Edric was imprisoned, awaiting the king's justice. Many of his allies were killed in the fighting, while others were captured and imprisoned alongside him. The region, once on the brink of rebellion, was slowly brought back under Edmund's control. Marjorie, despite her relief at Edmund's return and their victory, was haunted by the violence she had witnessed, by the knowledge that her actions, though necessary, had contributed to the bloodshed. She also mourned the loss of several of the castle staff, loyal servants who had been caught in the crossfire, innocent victims of Edric's ambition. One loss, in particular, weighed heavily on her. Sir Calin, the brave knight who had confessed his love, who had protected her, who had helped her send the message to Edmund, had been gravely wounded in the fighting. He lay in his chambers, his life hanging by a thread, his body ravaged by a sword wound that refused to heal. Marjorie visited him daily, tending to his wounds, soothing his fevered brow, whispering words of comfort and encouragement. She felt a deep sense of guilt, knowing that his injuries were a direct result of his loyalty to her, of his willingness to risk his life for her sake. Edmund, too, visited Calin, expressing his gratitude, his admiration, his regret. He knew of Calin's feelings for Marjorie, had sensed them long before Calin's confession. He had been jealous, at first, resentful of the knight's devotion to his wife. But now, seeing Calin's sacrifice, seeing his unwavering loyalty, he felt only respect and gratitude. One evening, as Marjorie sat by Calin's bedside, holding his hand, he opened his eyes, his gaze weak but lucid. My lady, he whispered, his voice barely audible. You are safe. Yes, Calin, Marjorie replied, her voice choked with emotion. Edmund is back. We are safe. Thanks to you. He smiled, a weak, fleeting smile. It was my honor, he said, to serve you, to protect you. He closed his eyes, his breathing becoming shallow, his grip on her hand weakening. Marjorie felt a surge of panic, a desperate fear that he was slipping away. Calin, she cried. Stay with me. Please stay with me. He opened his eyes again, his gaze fixed on hers. I love you, my lady, he whispered. Always, and then, his hand went limp, his breathing stopped, his eyes closed for the last time. He was gone. Marjorie wept, her tears falling onto his lifeless hand. She had lost a friend, a protector, a devoted admirer. She had lost a man who had loved her unconditionally, who had sacrificed his life for her. Edmund, hearing her cries, rushed into the room. He saw Calin's body, saw Marjorie's grief, and he understood. He knelt beside her, embracing her, offering comfort, sharing her sorrow. "He was a good man, Marjorie," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "A brave knight. A true friend. He loved me, Edmund," Marjorie sobbed. "And I could not return his love." Edmund held her tighter, his cheek resting against her hair. "I know," he said, "but he knew that. And he accepted it. He chose to protect you, to serve you, even knowing he could never have you." They mourned Kaelin together, honoring his memory, remembering his bravery, his loyalty, his unrequited love. They buried him in the castle chapel with full military honors, a testament to his service, his sacrifice, his unwavering devotion. But even as they grieved, a new threat was emerging. A new thread of treachery was being woven. Lady Annalise, though seemingly subdued after her public humiliation, had not given up her ambitions. She had secretly supported Edric's rebellion, hoping to benefit from Edmund's downfall. And now, with Edric imprisoned and Kaelin dead, she saw a new opportunity to advance her own interests. She began to spread rumors, to sow seeds of doubt, to undermine Marjorie's position once again. This time, however, her whispers were more insidious, more dangerous. She hinted at Marjorie's involvement in Kaelin's death, suggesting that she had encouraged his affections, that she had used him, that she had led him to his doom. She wanted to exploit the one thing that made Marjorie vulnerable: grief, and the guilt that accompanied it. Chapter 15. A Glimmer of Dawn. Annalise's poisonous whispers began to spread through the castle, subtle at first, then more blatant, more insistent. Servants exchanged furtive glances, knights muttered amongst themselves, and the ladies of the court, ever eager for gossip, fueled the flames of suspicion. Marjorie, still grieving Kaelin's death, felt the weight of their scrutiny, the sting of their unspoken accusations. She felt isolated, vulnerable, betrayed once again. Edmund, sensing her distress, tried to reassure her, to protect her from the rumors. He dismissed Annalise's whispers as the ravings of a jealous, embittered woman, unworthy of attention. He publicly reaffirmed his trust in Marjorie, his love for her, his belief in her innocence. But the rumors persisted, fueled by Annalise's cunning, by the lingering resentment of some of Edric's former allies, and by the natural human tendency to believe the worst, especially in times of uncertainty and grief. Marjorie, increasingly isolated and distressed, began to doubt herself. She replayed her interactions with Kaelin, searching for any sign of impropriety, any indication that she had unintentionally encouraged his affections, that she had led him astray. She felt a crushing weight of guilt, a sense of responsibility for his death, even though she knew, rationally, that she was not to blame. One evening, as she sat alone in her chambers, staring into the fire, she heard a knock on her door. It was Edmund, his face drawn, his eyes shadowed with concern. "Marjorie," he said, his voice gentle. "We need to talk." She nodded, her heart heavy with dread. She knew what was coming. The rumors had reached him, had poisoned his mind, had eroded his trust. He entered, closing the door behind him. He stood for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the room, before settling on her. "I have heard the whispers, Marjorie," he said, his voice hesitant. "The accusations." She looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "They are lies, Edmund," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I swear it. I never encouraged Kaelin. I never used him." He took a step closer, his presence filling the room. "I want to believe you, Marjorie," he said, his voice strained. "I need to believe you. But it is difficult. There are so many voices. So much doubt." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. Do you not trust me, Edmund?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Do you believe them? Do you think me capable of such treachery?" He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the curve of her jaw. "I love you, Marjorie," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "I want to trust you. But I am confused. I am hurt. I do not know what to believe." His words, his honesty, his vulnerability, pierced her heart. She saw the pain in his eyes, the struggle within him, the conflict between his love for her and the seeds of doubt that had been planted. "I will prove it to you, Edmund," she said, her voice firm, her determination renewed. "I will expose Annalise's lies. I will clear my name. I will restore your trust." She stood up, her back straight, her chin lifted. She would not be defeated. She would not let the rumors, the accusations, the grief destroy her. She would fight. For herself. For Edmund. For their love.
"How?"
Edmund asked, his voice filled with a mixture of hope and skepticism. "How will you prove your innocence?" Marjorie smiled, a determined, almost defiant smile. "I have a plan," she said. "A plan that will expose Annalise's treachery. A plan that will reveal the truth. A plan that will silence the whispers once and for all." She would use Annalise's own weapon against her deception. She would set a trap, a subtle, carefully crafted trap that would reveal Annalise's true nature, her malicious intent, her lies. She explained her plan to Edmund, outlining the steps, the risks, the potential consequences. He listened intently, his initial skepticism slowly giving way to admiration, to respect, to a renewed hope. "It is dangerous, Marjorie," he said, his voice filled with concern. "If you fail, if she discovers your plan, I will not fail," Marjorie said, her voice confident. "I have nothing left to lose. Except you. And I will not lose you. I will not let her win." Edmund embraced her, his arms wrapping tightly around her, his cheek resting against her hair. "Be careful, Marjorie," he whispered. "Be careful. I could not bear to lose you." "And I you," she replied, her voice muffled against his chest. "I will be careful. I promise." They stood there for a long moment, clinging to each other, drawing strength from their shared love, their renewed trust, their determination to overcome the challenges that lay ahead. A glimmer of dawn, a fragile hope, had appeared on the horizon, a promise of a future free from the shadows of doubt, the whispers of treachery, the pain of loss. But the trap had to be perfect. One misstep, and it would all fall apart. Chapter 16. The Lion and the Rose. Marjorie's plan was intricate, risky, and required perfect timing. She needed to create a situation where Annalise would feel comfortable revealing her true feelings, her true intentions, without fear of exposure. She needed to lure her into a trap, a carefully constructed web of deception that would expose her lies and clear Marjorie's name. She decided to use Annalise's own ambition against her. She knew that Annalise still harbored a desire for Edmund, still dreamed of becoming Lady Warwick. Marjorie would play on that desire, offering Annalise a false hope, a glimmer of a chance to achieve her ambition. She began by subtly distancing herself from Edmund, creating the impression that their relationship was strained, that they were growing apart. She spent less time with him in public, avoided his gaze, spoke to him with a cool formality that belied their true feelings. She also began to confide in Annalise, seeking her counsel, sharing her false anxieties, expressing her doubts about Edmund's love. She painted a picture of a marriage on the brink of collapse, a relationship riddled with mistrust and regret. Annalise, sensing an opportunity, eagerly embraced Marjorie's confidence. She offered words of comfort, of sympathy, of false support. She encouraged Marjorie's doubts, fueled her anxieties, subtly undermining her confidence in Edmund. Marjorie, playing her part perfectly, pretended to be swayed by Annalise's words, to be grateful for her friendship, to be trusting of her advice. She confided in Annalise about her grief over Kaelin's death, expressing her false guilt, her self-recrimination. "I feel responsible, Annalise," Marjorie said, her voice choked with feigned emotion. I encouraged his affections. I used him. I led him to his doom." Annalise, her eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction, placed a comforting hand on Marjorie's arm. "You must not blame yourself, my dear," she said, her voice dripping with false sincerity. "It was his choice. He was a fool. He was blinded by his love for you." Marjorie, seizing the opportunity, pressed further. "But Edmund, he does not understand," she said, her voice trembling. He suspects me.
He doubts me. He is growing distant. Annalise's smile widened, a cruel, triumphant smile that she could no longer conceal. Perhaps, she said, her voice a silky whisper, he is beginning to realize the truth. Perhaps he is beginning to see you for what you really are. Marjorie, controlling her anger, feigned despair. What am I to do, Annalise? She asked, her voice pleading. I cannot bear to lose him. I love him. Annalise, believing she had Marjorie completely in her grasp, revealed her true intentions. There is a way, my dear, she said, her voice low and conspiratorial. A way to rid yourself of this burden. A way to secure your future. A way to be with the man you truly desire. She leaned closer, her breath warm on Marjorie's ear. Edmund is a powerful man, she whispered. But he is also vulnerable. He is easily manipulated. If you were to remove him, if you were to become Lady Warwick, you could have everything. You could have power. You could have wealth. You could have me. Marjorie, her heart pounding with a mixture of revulsion and triumph, pretended to be shocked, horrified, yet intrigued. But how? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. How could I possibly? Annalise smiled, a cold, calculating smile that sent a shiver down Marjorie's spine.
There are ways, my dear, she said.
Subtle ways. Unseen ways. Ways that would leave no trace. Ways that would make it look like an accident. Or a suicide. She reached into her sleeve and pulled out a small, glass vial filled with a dark, viscous liquid. This, she said, her voice a seductive whisper, is a poison. A powerful poison. A single drop in his wine would be enough. No one would suspect a thing. Marjorie, her hand trembling, reached out and took the vial. She stared at it, her mind reeling, her heart filled with a mixture of disgust and elation. She had her proof. She had exposed Annalise's treachery, her murderous intent, her lies. At that moment, Edmund, who had been hidden behind a tapestry, listening to the entire conversation, stepped out into the open, his face a mask of fury. Annalise, he said, his voice thundering through the room. You are under arrest. For conspiracy. For attempted murder. For treason. Annalise, her face paling, her eyes wide with terror, stared at Edmund in disbelief. She had been trapped. She had been exposed. She had failed. Marjorie, her mission accomplished, her name cleared, her love reaffirmed, collapsed into Edmund's arms, her body shaking with relief and exhaustion. The lion and the rose, united once again, had defeated the serpent in their midst. But the poison, it was real, and the intent was real. The threat had been real, and Marjorie realized that it was she who had almost been the victim, not just of reputation, but of Annalise's murderous ambition. Chapter 17. Blood and Betrayal. Annalise's arrest sent shockwaves through the castle. The servants, who had once whispered about Marjorie, now whispered about Annalise, their fear and suspicion turning towards the woman who had so skillfully manipulated them. The knights, who had once doubted Marjorie's loyalty, now rallied to her side, their respect for her courage and intelligence renewed. Annalise was imprisoned, awaiting trial for her crimes. She refused to speak, to confess, to implicate anyone else. She maintained a defiant silence, her eyes filled with hatred and resentment, her spirit unbroken. Edmund, relieved that Marjorie was safe, that the plot had been foiled, that their love had been reaffirmed, turned his attention to the administration of justice. He convened a council of lords, inviting those who had remained loyal to him, to witness Annalise's trial and to pronounce judgment. The trial was swift and decisive. Marjorie, as the primary witness, recounted Annalise's words, her actions, her murderous intent. She presented the vial of poison as evidence, a tangible proof of Annalise's treachery. Edmund, acting as both accuser and judge, presented the case against Annalise with unwavering conviction. He spoke of her ambition, her jealousy, her lies. He spoke of her attempt to destroy his marriage, to undermine his authority, to take his life. The assembled lords, swayed by the evidence, by Marjorie's testimony,
by Edmund's impassioned plea, found Annalise guilty on all counts. They condemned her to death, the traditional punishment for treason and attempted murder. Edmund, though relieved that justice had been served, was deeply troubled by the sentence. He had never ordered the execution of a woman before, and the thought of Annalise, a member of his own family, however distant, meeting such a fate filled him with unease. He confided in Marjorie, sharing his doubts, his fears, his conflicting emotions. "I do not relish this, Marjorie," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I do not wish to see her die. But I have no choice. I must uphold the law. I must protect my people. I must ensure that such treachery is never repeated." Marjorie, understanding his dilemma, offered words of comfort and support. "You are doing what is right, Edmund," she said. "You are acting as a just and merciful lord. You are protecting your realm. You are protecting us." She took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. "Annalise made her choice," she said. "She chose to betray you. She chose to plot against you. She chose to attempt murder. She must face the consequences." Edmund nodded, his expression grim. "I know," he said, "but it is still difficult. It is still a heavy burden to bear." The execution was scheduled for the following morning in the castle courtyard before the assembled household and the representatives of the local villages. It was a public spectacle, a grim reminder of the consequences of treachery, a demonstration of Edmund's authority and his resolve. Marjorie, though she had played a crucial role in Annalise's downfall, could not bring herself to witness the execution. She remained in her chambers, praying for Annalise's soul, praying for Edmund's strength, praying for peace. As the hour of the execution approached, a commotion erupted in the castle. Shouts, screams, and the clang of steel echoed through the corridors. Edmund, alerted by the noise, rushed to the courtyard, his sword drawn, his men at arms at his side. He found a scene of chaos. Annalise, having somehow escaped from her cell, was wielding a dagger, her eyes wild, her expression desperate. She had attacked the guards, killing one and wounding several others. She was surrounded by Edmund's men, but she refused to surrender, fighting with the ferocity of a cornered animal. "I will not die," she screamed. "I will not be humiliated. I will take you all with me." Edmund, seeing the danger, ordered his men to stand down. He approached Annalise cautiously, his sword lowered, his voice calm and soothing. "Annalise," he said, "it is over. Surrender. Do not make this worse." Annalise, her face contorted with rage and despair, lunged at Edmund, the dagger aimed at his heart. Before Edmund could react, a figure stepped in front of him, blocking Annalise's attack. It was Lord Edric. The dagger plunged into Edric's chest, piercing his heart. He gasped, his eyes widening in surprise and pain, before collapsing to the ground. Annalise, stunned by what she had done, dropped the dagger, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes filled with horror. Edmund rushed to Edric's side, kneeling beside him, cradling his head in his arms.
"Edric," he cried. "Why?"
"Why did you?" Edric, his voice weak, his breathing labored, looked up at Edmund. I owed you," he whispered. I betrayed you. I had to make amends." He coughed, blood trickling from his mouth. "Forgive me, Edmund," he whispered. "Forgive me," and then his eyes closed, his body went limp, his life extinguished. He was gone. Edmund, his heart shattered, his mind reeling, wept over his uncle's body. He had lost his enemy, his betrayer, but also a member of his family, a man who had once been his mentor, his advisor, his friend. And he had died saving Edmund's life. Annalise, her escape attempt foiled, her last act of defiance ending in tragedy, was taken back into custody. She was executed shortly thereafter, her death swift and silent, a stark contrast to the chaos and bloodshed that had preceded it. The castle was plunged into mourning, a double tragedy that cast a long shadow over Edmund's victory, over Marjorie's vindication, over their fragile peace. Blood had been spilled, betrayal had run deep, and the scars of the past had been reopened. And the most unexpected thing had occurred. Edric, the cause of so much pain, had become a martyr, sacrificing himself to save the nephew he had tried to destroy. Chapter 18. A Fortress of Hearts. The deaths of Edric and Annalise left a void in Warwick Castle, a silence that echoed with unspoken grief, regret, and a lingering sense of unease. Edmund, burdened by the loss of his uncle, the man who had both betrayed and saved him, retreated into himself, his usual stoicism replaced by a profound melancholy. He spent hours in the chapel, praying for the souls of the departed, grappling with the complexities of loyalty, forgiveness, and the heavy price of leadership. Marjorie, though relieved that the immediate threats had been neutralized, was deeply affected by the violence and bloodshed. She mourned for Edric, for Kaelin, for the guards who had lost their lives, for the innocence that had been shattered. She felt a responsibility, a burden of guilt, even though she knew she was not to blame. She had acted to protect Edmund, to defend their love, to preserve their future. But the cost had been high, too high. She tried to reach out to Edmund, to offer comfort, to share his grief, to rekindle the connection that had been strained by the recent events. But he remained distant, withdrawn, lost in his own thoughts, his own sorrow. One evening, as she sat alone in their chambers, staring into the fire, she realized that she had to do something to break through his defenses, to reclaim the man she loved. She could not let the darkness consume him, could not let the past destroy their future. She decided to appeal to his sense of duty, to his commitment to his people, to his love for her. She knew that he was a strong man, a resilient man, a man who had overcome countless challenges. She had to remind him of that strength, to rekindle his spirit, to show him that he was not alone. She went to him, finding him in the library, poring over old maps and charts, his face illuminated by the flickering candlelight. He looked up as she entered, his expression weary, his eyes shadowed with sadness. "Marjorie," he said, his voice a low murmur. I did not hear you come in." "I know," she said, her voice soft. "You're lost in your thoughts." He nodded, his gaze returning to the maps. "I am trying to make sense of it all," he said. "Trying to understand. Trying to find a way forward." She walked over to him, placing a hand on his arm.
"You are not alone, Edmund," she said.
"I am here. We are together. We will find a way forward. Together." He looked up at her, his eyes searching hers. I do not know if I can, Marjorie," he said, his voice filled with doubt. I feel lost. I feel broken." She knelt beside him, taking his hand in hers. "You're not broken, Edmund," she said, her voice firm. "You are wounded, but wounds can heal. And you are stronger than you think." She reminded him of his victories, of his accomplishments, of the loyalty he inspired, of the love he shared with her. She spoke of his duty to his people, of his responsibility to protect them, to lead them. She spoke of their future, of the children they might have, of the life they could build together. Slowly, gradually, she saw a change in his expression. The weariness remained, but it was tempered by a flicker of hope, a glimmer of determination. He squeezed her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. "You are right, Marjorie," he said, his voice gaining strength. I cannot let the past consume me. I must look to the future. I must lead. I must protect. I must love." He stood up, pulling her with him. He embraced her, holding her close, his cheek resting against her hair. "Thank you, Marjorie," he whispered. "Thank you for reminding me. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for being my strength." "And you are mine, Edmund," she replied, her voice muffled against his chest. "Always." They stood there for a long moment, drawing strength from each other, reaffirming their bond, their love, their commitment to a future free from the shadows of the past. The fortress of Warwick Castle, once a symbol of strength and defense, had become a fortress of hearts, a sanctuary of love, a refuge from the storms of the world. They began to rebuild, to heal, to move forward. Edmund, with Marjorie by his side, returned to his duties, his leadership renewed, his spirit rekindled. He addressed the grievances of his people, implemented reforms, strengthened the castle's defenses, and prepared for any future challenges. Marjorie, too, found a renewed purpose. She took on a more active role in the running of the castle, overseeing the household, tending to the needs of the servants, organizing charitable works, and building bridges with the local community. She became a beloved figure, respected for her intelligence, her compassion, her strength. Together, they created a new era for Warwick Castle, an era of peace, prosperity, and love. The scars of the past remained, but they were no longer defining wounds. They were reminders of the challenges they had overcome, the battles they had fought, the love that had endured. And while they knew the outside world would continue to challenge, their internal fortress would hold. Chapter 19. The Weight of Forgiveness. Years passed, and Warwick Castle flourished under Edmund and Marjorie's rule. They had 2 children, a son named Alaric, after Marjorie's father, and a daughter named Alara, a name that meant shining one in an ancient tongue. The children brought joy and laughter to the castle, filling the halls with a sense of renewal, a promise of a brighter future. Edmund, though still haunted by the memories of Edric and Annalise, had found peace. He had learned to forgive, not to forget, but to accept the past, to learn from it, to move forward. He had become a wise and just ruler, respected by his people, feared by his enemies, and loved by his family. Marjorie, too, had found peace. She had healed from the wounds of the past, the loss of her family, the betrayals she had endured, the grief she had carried. She had become a strong and confident woman, a beloved wife, a devoted mother, a respected leader. One autumn day, as they stood on the battlements, watching their children play in the courtyard below, Edmund turned to Marjorie, his eyes filled with a deep, abiding love. "We have built something beautiful, Marjorie," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "Something strong. Something that will endure." Marjorie smiled, her heart overflowing with happiness. "Yes," she agreed. "We have. Together." He took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. "I never thought it possible," he said. "After Winthorne. After everything. I never thought I could find happiness. I never thought I could love again." She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "And she said, "I never thought I could forgive. I never thought I could trust. I never thought I could find a home in the arms of my enemy." He kissed her hair, his lips lingering on her temple. "You are not my enemy, Marjorie," he said. "You are my wife. You are my love. You are my life." She looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears of joy. "And you are mine, Edmund," she said. "Always." A raven landed on the battlement nearby, a sleek, black bird with intelligent eyes. It cawed once, then took flight, soaring into the clear blue sky. Marjorie remembered Shadow, the falcon that had carried her message to Edmund, the falcon that had saved their lives, that had brought them together. She remembered Kaelin, the brave knight who had loved her, who had sacrificed his life for her. She remembered Edric, the treacherous uncle who had died protecting Edmund, who had redeemed himself in his final act. She felt a pang of sadness, a lingering grief for those who had been lost, for the scars of the past. But the sadness was tempered by a sense of gratitude, of acceptance, of forgiveness. She had forgiven Edmund for his role in the downfall of Winthorne. She had forgiven Edric for his treachery. She had forgiven Annalise for her malice. She had even forgiven herself for the guilt she had carried, for the doubts she had harbored. Forgiveness, she realized, was not a single act, but a process, a journey. It was a journey of healing, of understanding, of acceptance. It was a journey that had led her to this moment, to this place of peace, of happiness, of love. Edmund, sensing her thoughts, squeezed her hand. "What are you thinking, my lady?" he asked, his voice gentle. She smiled, a wistful, knowing smile. "I am thinking about forgiveness," she said. "About the weight of it, about the power of it, about the freedom it brings." He nodded, his eyes understanding. "It is a heavy burden to carry, Marjorie," he said. "The burden of unforgiveness. It corrodes the soul. It poisons the heart. It prevents us from living. from loving. And it is a great gift to give, she added. The gift of forgiveness. It liberates us. It heals us. It allows us to move forward. They stood there for a long moment, hand in hand, gazing out at the landscape, at the rolling hills, the distant forests, the castle that had become their home. They had weathered many storms, overcome many challenges, endured many losses. But they had survived. They had thrived. They had found love in the midst of war, peace in the midst of chaos, forgiveness in the midst of betrayal. And as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the land, they knew that their journey was not over, that there would be other challenges, other storms to weather. But they also knew that they would face them together, united by their love, strengthened by their forgiveness, fortified by the unbreakable bond that had been forged in the crucible of their shared past. The weight had become a foundation. And that foundation was unshakable. Chapter 20. A Tapestry of Two Souls. The tapestry in Marjorie's chambers had become a symbol of their life together, a visual representation of their journey, their struggles, their triumphs, their love. It was a large, intricate work depicting scenes from their past, interwoven with images of their present and hopes for their future. Marjorie had begun the tapestry shortly after their marriage, a way to occupy her time, to express her emotions, to create something beautiful amidst the chaos and uncertainty of her new life. She had started with images of Winthorne, her childhood home, the sun-drenched gardens, the airy halls, the faces of her lost family. As her relationship with Edmund had evolved, as she had begun to heal, to forgive, to love, she had added new scenes, new images, new colors. She had depicted their wedding, the cold stone chapel, Edmund's surprisingly gentle touch, the uncertainty in their eyes. She had woven in scenes of Warwick Castle, the imposing fortress, the bustling courtyard, the faces of the people who had become her new family. She had included images of Callan, the brave knight, his face noble and serene, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. She had depicted Edric, his expression a mixture of regret and redemption, his final act of sacrifice etched in threads of silver and gray. She had even, with a heavy heart, included Annalise, her face a mask of ambition and despair, a reminder of the darkness they had overcome. As the years passed, she had added images of their children, Alaric and Alara, their playful laughter, their innocent eyes, their promise of a brighter future. She had woven in scenes of their life together, their shared joys, their quiet moments of intimacy, their unwavering love. The tapestry had become a living document, a testament to their resilience, their forgiveness, their transformation. It was a tapestry of two souls, interwoven, intertwined, inseparable. One evening, as they sat by the fire, their children asleep in their beds, Edmund gazed at the tapestry, his eyes tracing the intricate patterns, the vibrant colors, the stories woven within. "It is beautiful, Marjorie," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "It is a masterpiece. It is our life." Marjorie smiled, her heart filled with contentment. "It is a work in progress," she said. "It is never finished. There will always be new scenes to add, new stories to tell, new memories to weave." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. "I see myself," he said, his voice hesitant. "I see the man I was. I see the man I have become. And I see you, Marjorie. I see your strength. I see your grace. I see your love." She looked at him, her eyes shining with tears of joy. "And I see you, Edmund," she said. "I see the warrior. I see the husband. I see the father. I see the man I love." He leaned in and kissed her, a gentle, tender kiss that spoke of a love that had endured, that had deepened, that had transformed them both. It was a kiss that sealed their bond, that reaffirmed their commitment, that celebrated their life together. "There is one more scene I wish to add," Marjorie said, her voice a whisper. Edmund raised an eyebrow, his expression curious. "What scene is that, my lady?" he asked. She smiled, a mischievous, knowing smile. "A scene of us," she said. "Old and gray, sitting by the fire, surrounded by our grandchildren. A scene of peace. A scene of happiness. A scene of enduring love. Edmund chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. A fitting end, my lady, he said. A perfect ending to our story. Not an ending, Edmund, Marjorie corrected him. A continuation. Our story will never end. It will live on. In our children. In our grandchildren. In this tapestry. She stood up, taking his hand, leading him towards the tapestry. She picked up her needle and thread, her fingers moving with practiced ease, adding a few stitches, a few threads of silver and gold, to the scene she had described. Edmund watched her, his heart filled with a profound sense of gratitude, of peace, of love. He had found his home, his family, his happiness, in the arms of the woman who had once been his enemy, but who had become his everything. And as they stood there, together, in the flickering firelight, surrounded by the tapestry of their lives, they knew that their love story, their journey of forgiveness, their transformation, was a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a beacon of hope in a world often filled with darkness, a promise of a future where love, always, finds a way. It was no longer his story or her story.
It was their story.
And it would continue. Epilogue. The wind whispered through the ancient stones of Warwick Castle, carrying the scent of heather and the distant murmur of the sea. Marjorie, her hair now streaked with silver, her hands gnarled with age, sat on a bench in the garden, a familiar weight in her lap. It was the tapestry, almost too large now to manage, its edges frayed, its colors softened by time, but its story still vibrant, still alive. Alaric, her son, a strong and capable man, now Lord Warwick, stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. His own children, Edmund and Lyra, played nearby, their laughter echoing through the garden, a sound that always brought a smile to Marjorie's face. Alara, her daughter, was away, married to a powerful lord in the south, building her own family, weaving her own tapestry of life. But she visited often, bringing her children, sharing stories, strengthening the bonds that tied them together. Marjorie traced the familiar scenes on the tapestry, her fingers lingering on the images of her youth, of Winthorne, of her lost family. She touched the threads that depicted Edmund, his face strong and handsome, his eyes filled with love. He had been gone these past 10 years, taken by a sudden illness, a swift and unexpected departure that had left a void in her heart, a silence in the castle. But she was not alone. She had her children, her grandchildren, her memories. And she had the tapestry, a tangible reminder of their love story, their journey, their enduring bond. She added a few final stitches, a thread of silver to represent her own aging, a thread of gold to symbolize the lasting legacy of their love. She looked up at Alaric, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and pride. "It is finished," she said, her voice a whisper. "The tapestry is complete." Alaric knelt beside her, his hand covering hers. "It is beautiful, mother," he said. "It is a testament to your love, to your strength, to your life." She smiled, a wistful, knowing smile. "It is a story of forgiveness, Alaric," she said. "A story of redemption. A story of hope. A story that must never be forgotten." She closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face, the gentle breeze in her hair, the love that surrounded her. She had lived a long and full life, a life filled with challenges, with sorrows, with joys. She had known loss, betrayal, grief. But she had also known love, forgiveness, redemption. She had found a home in the arms of her enemy. She had built a family in the shadow of war. She had woven a tapestry of two souls, a tapestry that would endure, a tapestry that would inspire. And as she drifted off to sleep, surrounded by the love of her family, the whispers of the wind, the memories of the past, she knew that her story, their story, would live on, a beacon of hope in a world that so desperately needed it. The final thread was placed, and with a gentle sigh, she joined him. The tapestry remained, a testament to a love that conquered all.